So exciting to be here. Toronto and Dunjaba, Miigwech, Jaganashi Nanitandao. I'm from Toronto. My name is Soren Brothers. I grew up just about a 10-minute walk from here, and I'm a white man, also a settler, and feel very thankful to be in front of all of you today. As mentioned, I'm day-to-day working at the Royal Ontario Museum. I'm the Outland and Chief Curator of Climate Change there. I've been in that position for about a year. Beyond that, for the last 15, 20 years, I've been working as what's called a limnologist. I study water. And I've also, for the last 15 or 20 years, been a musician and playing music, touring, making albums, just for fun. So when I spoke with Kim and Johnny about coming here today, it just seemed like this amazing confluence of all these things and a weird position to be in as a scientist who plays music and is now working in a cultural institution, talking to music industry and thinking about climate change, and having been in all these different climate change conversations for the last year and just sort of living it, I didn't really know where to start. And I think I asked Kim early on, where do I, what should I even talk about? There's so many things and ideas, but also not knowing the spectrum of what the conversations are going to be today and where I could fit within that. So I figured probably the best thing was just talking about a little bit about what I'm doing and what I've done. And I think that there are things that come out of that could maybe be useful in the conversations that we're all going to be having today. The first is that before I was actually working at the ROM, I've spent the last 4 years before that as a professor in Utah, at Utah State University. So I was living in probably the most conservative town in the most conservative state in the US, teaching climate change to students and trying to do climate change research and science. And one of the first things when I was there, and I realized when I had a class of 70 or 80 undergrads who were from there, is that I didn't want to actually necessarily change their political beliefs. And my goal in that class was to have them understand climate change as a phenomenon that's happening. I wasn't trying to, I didn't want them to feel like accepting the science of what I was presenting and the facts of what I was presenting was going to impair their relationships with their parents or their families. I didn't believe that I could do that. And if I let them believe that those two things were somehow intertwined, I was going to fail, and there was no point in even trying to go further. So a lot of what I was trying to do was looking at having new conversations and reframing these kind of tribalistic, different perspectives that I felt they might have, and getting out of this notion that it's a political thing. Obviously, we need politics in terms of how we're going to deal with it, but we can talk about politics and how we get to net zero, how we're going to resolve the situation, not whether there's a problem. And I felt that that was something that I really worked at reframing, and water was actually a really powerful way to do that, to talk about the lakes that a lot of my students were fishing in the weekends. Again, we were in the mountains, and they cared about their environment, and they cared that their lakes were getting warmer, and I was able to even show them data and work with them and not have to go, have them trust IPCC, but just trust the local farmers who have been measuring ice cover in their lakes, and they could see that change was happening. So when I came here, that was a big thing that I pushed with the ROM when I was trying to get this job even, is saying, it's really important to be inclusive, to try and get everyone on the same page, finding these new conversations, and museums are great places, and cultural institutions are great places where we can find broader political support, moving away also from this idea that it's only individual decisions that are going to be solving the problem. So not having people feel guilty that they left their light on by accident in the basement last night and how climate change is going to be worse, but thinking more about these structural changes that we should be getting off of coal as a source of electricity, so that it doesn't matter if you leave your light on because it wasn't being generated by fossil fuels, that light. As I've been here in the last year, my perspectives have actually somewhat shifted a little bit since being at the ROM. One of the things that I've realized is just how important it is to still emphasize, that individual decisions do have important consequences. And a large part of that is just also giving people a sense of, well, not the sense, but the reality of empowering them to realize that what we do is important, especially for youth and a lot of people who don't necessarily even have the ability to vote. That empowerment can be really powerful. The other thing that I feel like I've seen and come to feel more and more as I've been working at the museum is in a way, I feel that the conversation about the causes and consequences of climate change is, the time for that is past. And we've known about the causes of climate change since the late 1800s. There's articles in the news from the 1890s talking about how we're going to be warming the globe by burning so much fossil fuels. It was on the cover of Time magazine in the 1980s. So that's not really news anymore. In terms of the consequences of climate change too, there's so much research, there's mountains of research that's shown that it can be devastating, that it is being devastating to a lot of ecosystems around the world, to a lot of societies around the world. Climate justice is a huge issue. The consequences are not also really news in a way. I was looking for what the gap is that the Royal Ontario Museum could serve, and my sort of curatorial weird position there could fill, and had lots of conversations with people, and I felt that the biggest gap is actually just understanding about the solutions, and not the solutions that need to happen even, but the solutions that are happening and that have been happening, and how I hadn't even realized until I started the job and having conversations with people in the city how much is actually changing, and how much this perception of inertia isn't really necessarily entirely accurate. I mean, I didn't realize, I came back to Toronto kind of laughing at the notion that Toronto was seeing itself as a forward city on the climate front. You look at the traffic at the 401, I hadn't realized that Toronto's CO2 emissions in terms of our transport and buildings and all these things had decreased by 40% since 1990, and it surpassed the Kyoto Protocol reductions because Ontario phased out coal from 2005 to 2014. I didn't realize that that was actually the largest carbon mitigation action on the continent, and I think it still stands to that to date. I also didn't realize that Toronto has, as far as I know, is the largest urban climate adaptation project on the planet, which is the Portland's Flood Protection Project, where they're redesigning the whole mouth of the Don River. It's $1.3 billion. They're working with Anishinaabe First Nations, and I think Haudenosaunee as well, to bring back medicinal plants that they're going to be planting in there. They've created 2 powwow sites. They're creating fire ceremonial sites. They're totally shifting, the way that we're looking at the river and the waters and the way that we're interacting with our environment in a really fundamental way. And it's a part climate adaptation because we're living in a flood zone, but they're also creating sustainable housing and looking at ways to make it climate positive, where it's actually taking more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than it's putting in. All of these things are happening, and they've been happening for years. And it's kind of interesting just realizing that I had to get this weird job where I was focusing on climate change 100% of my time for a year, for that to click that, oh my God, like there's momentum happening. And that's not to say that we're there and it's solved and we can all go home now, but to realize that it's not, we're not starting with a static position that we have to start pushing forward and get something moving. It's a matter of getting that to go faster and stronger, and people getting more behind it and building public understanding and support for what these changes are that are happening around us. And then one last thing I'm just going to leave off on, too, that I feel is kind of emerging from that, is how great these changes are. Look at that decarbonizing of Ontario's power grid. The reason we did that apparently actually was not because of climate change, but because of public health. So in the early 2000s, you probably remember if you were in Toronto that there was pretty regular smog days and smog alerts and days you couldn't go out. Ontario recognized, the government recognized that was actually a big cause, like burning coal for our electricity was a big cause of respiratory illness and smog days. So that was a big reason that they actually phased it out. And by 2014, there were 0 smog days. So this is a huge climate adaptation or climate mitigation progress that we made on the basis of public health. And then same thing, looking at the reshaping of the mouth of the Don River right now, they're building in kayak spots where you can go access the river. You can actually interact with the river. The only thing I knew about the Don River growing up in Toronto as a kid was that if you accidentally fall in it or touch it, you had to, use Q-tips with hydrogen peroxide to clear out, your ears or your nose or anything that got wet. There was this. It's a I can't even say for people who didn't grow up in Toronto, like what a fundamental shift it is in our understanding of the river to now want to go kayaking in the Don River and have a place where you can sit and have a drink and look at the water flow by, and respecting the waters that way. Like, these are really fundamental positive transformations in our society that are happening. And this is what climate mitigation and climate adaptation looks like. And I think that there's a really valuable way that cultural institutions and cultural players, including musicians, can think about not just what we're running away from climate change as a negative driver and what we're trying to get less bad, but also what we're actually running towards in terms of a much better situation and a much better future that is climate adapted and climate mitigated. And I wouldn't want to push too hard on what musicians should be saying or shouldn't be saying, but there's so many roles that they can play in that future, and I think it's really valuable to talk about that. Everything from also the power of of music in terms of mental health and all of the mental health issues, for instance, like high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in Fort McMurray in northern Alberta since the fire. I mean, all of these things, there's so many elements of society that music can serve, both in terms of how we adapt to climate change and what the climate future is still going to look like, even if we mitigate 100%. We still need to live in this warmer future that we haven't seen what's fully going to happen yet, but also in finding inspiration in terms of how we're going to get there and getting us there faster. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.